Tonight, I bring you the story of one old man of Edo and of the most famous wave in the world. You know the wave. Deep blue water rising like a great claw over 3 small boats, and far behind it, small and calm, Mount Fuji. The man who made it in Edo by hand was past 70 years old. He spent 90 years learning to draw, and at the end of his life, he said that 5 more years might have made him a true painter. Tonight, we follow that life, from a boy with a brush to the image the whole world now carries in its pocket. So settle in and let the old master's patience hold you, because there is no hurry anywhere in this story. If these quiet nights from Japan help you rest, subscribing keeps them coming to you. And if something here stays with you, I would love to read it in the comments. And now, let us begin. Close your eyes and come with me to Edo in the autumn of the year 1760. Edo is the city that will one day be called Tokyo, but tonight it is still Edo, one of the largest cities on earth, a city of 1 million people, of wooden houses and narrow lanes, of canals and bridges and lantern light. The shogun rules from his castle at the center, and around the castle the city spreads outward like rings on water. It is a city at peace, and it has been at peace for a long time, and in that long peace something remarkable has happened. The ordinary people of the city, the carpenters and fish sellers and cloth dyers and boatmen, have built a culture of their own. They have their theaters, their storytellers, their poets, their festivals, and they have their pictures. On the eastern side of the great river that runs through Edo, in a low district of artisans called Honjo, where drainage ditches run beside the lanes and the smell of the river hangs in the air, a boy is born. The exact day is not certain. Records from that time are thin, and historians still discuss it. But tradition places his birth in the autumn of 1760. His childhood name is Tokitaro. Later he will be called Tetsuzo. Much later he will be called by another name, and then another, and then another. More names than any painter his country has ever known. But we are far from that. Tonight he is only a baby in a narrow wooden house on the east side of the great river, in a plain, hard-working neighborhood of craftsmen. It is believed that he was raised in the household of a mirror maker, a craftsman named Nakajima Ise, who polished bronze mirrors for the household of the shogun himself. Think of that workshop for a moment. In Edo, a mirror was not glass, it was bronze, polished so finely that a face could rise out of the metal. The work was slow and quiet, and around the rim of such mirrors, the maker painted designs, cranes and pines and waves, small, careful decorations on the back of the metal. A child in that house would have grown up watching a grown man bend over a small surface for hours, bringing something beautiful out of it by patience alone. The boy later said of himself, in words that have been passed down, that from the age of 6, he had a passion for copying the forms of things. 6 years old, a child kneeling on a wooden floor, drawing with whatever came to hand, the shape of a sparrow, the curve of a roof, the way a boatman leans on his pole. From the age of 6 and for more than 80 years after that, he would do almost nothing else. There are children who draw and then grow out of it. This child drew and grew into it, deeper and deeper, all his life. Stay in that lane in Honjo a little longer. It is evening there. Smoke rises from kitchen fires. A vendor calls out the last of his tofu. Somewhere a dog barks twice and settles. The boy sits inside the doorway with a scrap of paper, and he is drawing the vendor, the pole across the vendor's shoulders, the 2 buckets swaying. He does not draw the way children are told to draw. He draws the way water finds its path downhill, because it cannot do otherwise. At the age of 12, the boy was sent to work in a bookshop, a lending library. And here I want you to see something lovely about Edo, something the world rarely hears. In this city, in the 1770s, ordinary working people read for pleasure, and they read constantly. Books were printed from carved woodblocks, page after page, text and pictures cut into wood, inked and pressed onto paper. Lending libraries carried these books through the streets and rented them for a few coins, so that a carpenter's wife or a shop clerk could spend an evening with a story. The boy spent his days surrounded by these printed books, handling them, sorting them, and, we may be sure, reading them, studying the pictures inside them. Every book that passed through his hands was a lesson. Here is how a master draws rain. Here is how a master draws a horse at full run. Here is how a face shows fear or laughter or longing. At 14, he went deeper into that world. He was apprenticed to a woodcarver, and he learned the craft that lies underneath every printed picture, the craft most people never see. To make a woodblock print, an artist draws the design on thin paper, but then a carver pastes that paper face down onto a block of hard wood and cuts away everything that is not the line. The drawing itself is destroyed in the process. Only the carved block remains holding the drawing in reverse, ready for ink. The carver's knife must follow the artist's brush line exactly. Every taper, every flick, every place where the brush pressed harder or lifted away. For 4 years, the boy cut lines into wood. His hands learned what a line truly is, not as a mark of ink, but as a ridge of wood with 2 carved walls. Very few painters ever learn their art from underneath like this. He did. All his life, his drawings would have a special quality, lines that seemed carved even when brushed, and this is where it began. In the wood dust of a carver's shop, in a boy's aching hands. At 18, he took the step that set the course of everything. He was accepted into the studio of Katsukawa Shunsho, one of the leading print designers of Edo. The Katsukawa school was famous above all for its portraits of kabuki actors. Understand what that meant? Kabuki was the roaring heart of popular Edo, theater of painted faces and thundering feet and impossible poses held at the peak of emotion. The actors were the most famous people in the city, and when a great actor took the stage in a new role, people wanted a picture of him, the way people today want a photograph of someone they admire. Print publishers supplied that desire. An artist drew the actor, carvers cut the blocks, printers pressed the colors, and within days, the image was in the shops, affordable to nearly anyone. This was ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, an art form that belonged to the people, made fresh every season, alive in the streets. There has rarely been anything like it anywhere, an entire great city buying and trading images of its own life. Within a year, the master gave the young man an artist's name, Shunro, built from a syllable of the master's own name, which was an honor. And in 1779, at about 19 years old, Shunro published his first prints, pictures of kabuki actors in the manner of the school. If you saw them today, you might pass them by. They are competent, careful, obedient work, a young artist keeping inside the lines of his school's style. Nothing in them announces what is coming. The most famous image his nation ever produced did not begin with a thunderclap. It began with a young man doing ordinary work, learning his trade, keeping his brush moving. For roughly 15 years, he worked in and around the Katsukawa school. He married during those years. His first wife died young in the early 1790s, and he later married again and lost his second wife too, after only a few years. He had children. Life gave him what it gives most people: love and labor and grief, and through all of it, the brush kept moving. That is the one constant in this whole long story. Whatever the year brought him, the brush kept moving. Then, in 1793, the master Shunsho died, and soon after, something happened that could have ended this story and instead made it. The leadership of the school passed to the senior disciple, Shunko, and Shunko expelled our artist from the school. The reasons are not fully certain. It is said he had been quietly studying with a rival school of painting, the Kano school, which served the ruling class, and that this was seen as disloyalty. Whatever the cause, the doors closed behind him. He was in his 30s, twice widowed, and now cast out of the only professional home he had. Years later, he said something extraordinary about this moment. He said that what truly drove the growth of his art was the humiliation he suffered at Shunko's hands. Listen to that again, softly. Not the praise he received, the humiliation. He took the worst professional wound of his life and used it as a whetstone. There is a quiet lesson in that for any of us lying awake with a bruised pride, and he did not merely say it. He lived it. Cut loose from the school of actor portraits, he stopped drawing what the school drew. He turned his eyes elsewhere, to landscapes, to daily life, to the people of Edo themselves at their work and their play, subjects the print world had barely touched. In losing his place, he found his direction. Ukiyo-e, until then, had looked mostly at the famous, at actors and celebrated beauties. He began turning it toward everything else, toward the whole visible world. And in time, that turn would change the art itself. In the years that followed, he passed through the orbit of another tradition, taking the name Tawaraya Sori and working in a graceful decorative manner, producing elegant, privately commissioned prints and pictures of slender, willowy beauties that Edo adored. He could have stayed there. The style sold. His figures in those years, tall and fine-featured, set a small fashion of their own. But staying was never in him. After a few years, he passed the name Sori on to a pupil, the way a man hands over a coat that no longer fits, and moved on again. And here we arrive at one of the strangest and most wonderful facts about this man. Over his lifetime, he used about 30 different artist names. 30, Shunro, Sori, Taito, Iitsu, and more playful ones, defiant ones, including one that simply announced him as a man mad about painting. Other artists of his time changed names too. It was part of the culture, but no one changed names like he did. Some he sold or gave to students. Some he shed the way a snake sheds skin, because the artist who had worn that name was finished, and a new one was beginning. Most people spend their lives building one name and then guarding it. He kept throwing his away. Each name was a little death and a little birth, a way of saying whatever I mastered yesterday, I am a beginner again this morning. Remember this when we come to the end of his story. To the old man, ask him for 5 more years. The asking began here, in a man who would not let himself arrive. Around the turn of the century, when he was approaching 40, he declared his independence from every school and every master, and he signed his work with the name the world now knows, Hokusai. The name means, roughly, North Studio, and it carried a private meaning. He held to an old belief of his family's tradition, a devotion centered on the North Star, the one star that does not wander, the still point the whole night sky turns around. Sailors and travelers had always steered by it. He took it as his own fixed point and named himself after it. Every time he signed a picture, he was quietly pointing at that star. All things turn and change. Hold to the one thing that does not. And the man himself, in these middle years, what was he like? The stories that survive paint someone Edo itself found unforgettable. He cared nothing for money, though his work sold well. When payment came, it is said, he left the packets unopened and handed them over untouched when a bill collector knocked, never counting, because counting was time away from drawing. He cared nothing for comfort. He and his household did not cook much, living on bought food, sweet buns especially, for he had a famous sweet tooth, and when a room grew too cluttered and stale to bear, he did not clean it. He moved. It is said he moved house 93 times in his life. 93 times. There is even a tradition that he once moved 3 times in a single day. Picture it. An old man with ink-stained fingers carrying his brushes and a kettle down an Edo lane. Again, while the neighbors watch from their doorways and shake their heads with affection. The city told these stories about him the way a family tells stories about a beloved impossible uncle. But do not mistake the eccentricity for foolishness. Everything he refused, comfort, tidiness, money, small talk, he refused for one reason. Every hour of his life was either drawing or in the way of drawing, and he simply removed whatever was in the way. There is a purity in that which commands respect. Edo gave him its respect, and it gave him its delight too, because he knew how to delight a crowd. A story is told of a day in Nagoya where he stayed while preparing his printed sketchbooks, when he announced a public performance. In a great open courtyard, before an enormous crowd, assistants rolled out a sheet of paper vast beyond anything a painting had a right to be, the size of more than 100 tatami mats. Hokusai took up a broom-sized brush, and with buckets of ink, walking across the paper itself, he painted a portrait of the great sage Daruma, so large that the finished face could only be seen properly when the sheet was hoisted high on a frame against the sky. The crowd roared. The local people gave him an affectionate nickname for it, and the story traveled ahead of him ever after. Another story, and this one is told of an audience before the shogun himself, says that he was once summoned to demonstrate his art against a rival. Hokusai laid down a long sheet of paper, brushed a broad curving band of blue across it, then took a rooster, dipped its feet in vermilion ink, and set it loose to run down the paper, leaving a trail of red prints. He bowed and announced the subject. Autumn leaves floating on the Tatsuta River. The blue was the water. The rooster's footprints were the drifting red maple leaves. Whether every detail of these tales is exact, historians cannot promise. But Edo told them and retold them, because they were true to the man. He could paint a sparrow on a grain of rice, it was said, and a sage the size of a courtyard, and both were fully alive. Under the name Hokusai, through his 40s and 50s, he worked at a pace that is difficult to believe. He illustrated popular novels, long-running adventure tales that Edo readers waited for, the way people now wait for a new season of a beloved story. He designed greeting prints, poetry prints, board games, picture books. Students came to him, first a few, then dozens, eventually well over 100 across his lifetime, drawn by the gravity of his skill. And for them, And for craftsmen all over the country who wanted models to work from, he began in his mid-50s to publish something that would carry his hand into every corner of the land. Printed sketchbooks, volume after volume of drawings, thousands upon thousands of them, with a title that meant something like Sketches Flowing Free, whatever the brush happened upon. Hokusai's Manga, they were called, in the old sense of the word, and inside them was everything. Everything. Wrestlers and dancers and travelers and legendary heroes. Fish, frogs, cats stretching, rain, lightning, waterfalls, people diving, people sneezing, people balancing on one foot. The precise anatomy of a wave breaking. Studies of fat men and thin men, of every human face pulling every human expression. It was as if he had set himself the task of drawing the complete inventory of the visible world and was well on his way to finishing it. The volumes were bestsellers. Craftsmen kept them beside their benches. Children pored over them. 15 volumes would eventually appear, and they spread through the country like water through cloth. By his 60th year, then, this man was famous, endlessly copied, surrounded by students, his sketchbooks in workshops across the nation. 60, in Edo, was a threshold. It was the completion of the great calendar cycle, the age at which a man was expected to shave his head, take a retirement name, hand the shop to his son, and sit in the sun. 60 was the age of arrival, the age of enough. He did not think so. In his own accounting, made years later with devastating honesty, he looked back at this entire mountain of work, the thousands of prints and books and paintings, the fame, the students, the 50 years of labor, and he declared that nothing he had produced before the age of 70 was truly worth counting. Nothing worth counting. He was not being modest for show. He meant it. Somewhere in him lived a picture of what painting could be, and against that picture, everything his hands had yet done fell short. So as Edo's snows came and melted, and the plum trees flowered by the canals, and the man from Honjo passed 60, and then 65, he did not slow into honored old age. He was gathering. Life in those years struck him hard, and we will speak of it. But hold this image as this first part of our story closes. An old man in a cluttered rented room on the east side of the river, sweet bean cakes forgotten beside him, grinding his ink in the cold before dawn, utterly certain, against all evidence of age, that his real work had not even started. He was right. The wave was still out there ahead of him, waiting in the years past 70. And the whole world, though it did not know it yet, was waiting too. In his late 60s, the storms found him. Not storms of water yet, storms of living. His second wife died. A grandson, a reckless young man, ran up debts that fell upon the old artist to settle, debts heavy enough that for a time he had to leave Edo altogether and stay with relatives on the coast at Turaga, keeping out of reach of the collectors. Around the age of 68, his body itself turned against him. He suffered a stroke. For a painter, imagine the terror of it. The numbness spreading toward the hands, toward the one thing that mattered. And here the man's strangeness shows its other face, the face of iron. He refused to surrender to it. It is said he prepared his own remedy from an old recipe, a preparation of yuzu citrus simmered in sake, and dosed himself and worked his hands and recovered. Historians cannot say what truly healed him, but he did recover, fully enough to hold a brush with all his old command. Keep that picture. An old man in a poor room. hands wrapped around a warm cup that smells of citrus, flexing his fingers open and closed, refusing. So there he stands at the edge of his 70s, bereaved, in debt, recently half paralyzed, in an age when most people did not live to 50 at all. By every rule of every era, his story is over. Instead, a publisher came to him. Nishimuraya Yohachi, a shrewd and ambitious Edo publisher, proposing a major new series of landscape prints. And they had something new to build it with, something that had just arrived in the marketplaces. A pigment, a deep, vivid, almost supernatural blue, made across the sea and newly imported in quantity, cheap enough at last to use freely. Japan had always loved indigo, the soft blue of workmen's coats and summer curtains. But this new blue was different, saturated and glowing, a blue that did not fade, a blue like deep water with light inside it. Painters and publishers were dazzled by it. Whole prints began to appear done in shades of blue alone, and the public loved them. And the subject of the new series would be the one subject no one in the country could ever tire of: Mount Fuji. I want to pause here in the quiet on that mountain, because everything that follows rests on it. Fuji is not simply a large mountain. It is the most perfect form the Japanese landscape owns, a single symmetrical cone rising alone out of the plains, visible from Edo itself on clear days, floating white above the rooftops like something not entirely of this world. For centuries, it had been climbed, painted, honored in the old ways, and written into poetry. It stood for permanence. Dynasties of shoguns had risen, and the mountain had watched. And in Hokusai's own old age, Fuji held one more meaning, a private one. An old belief connected the mountain with the secret of long life, even of life without end. An old man who intended to paint until 110 had reasons of his own to keep that mountain before his eyes. So the series was announced, 36 views of Mount Fuji. The idea was simple and endless at once. The same mountain, again and again, but never the same picture, seen from the sea, from the pine shore, from the tea fields, from the scaffolding of a timber yard, through the hoop of a barrel. A cooper is bending, from beneath a great bridge, in summer lightning, in clear morning wind. The mountain would hold still, and the whole living country would turn around it, the way the night sky turns around the North Star. Perhaps you hear the echo. The man who had named himself for the still point of the heavens now built his greatest work around the still point of the land. The prints began appearing around 1830 or 1831, when Hokusai was about 70 years old, published sheet by sheet, sold in the print shops of Edo for a modest price, roughly the cost of a good helping of noodles, it is said. They were not made for palaces. They were made for anyone, for the carpenter and the maid and the pilgrim, to buy with pocket change and take home and pin to a wall. The public seized on them. The series was meant to be 36 views, but the demand was so great that the publisher kept it going, adding 10 more designs, 46 views in all, under the old title, because no one was counting, and everyone wanted more. And among the first of them, there was the wave. Let us stand in front of it together, slowly, the way the people of Edo first did, at a print shop under the eaves on a bright cold day. The sheet is modest, about the size of a cutting board you might have in your own kitchen, small enough to hold in 2 hands. The title, written in a cartouche in the upper corner, says, in the manner of the series, Under the Wave off Kanagawa. Kanagawa was a coastal stretch along the great road out of Edo, on the bay, where cargo boats ran. Now look, the way his own people looked. Japanese writing runs from right to left, and Edo eyes entered a picture from the right. So the first thing they met was not the wave. It was the boats. 3 long, slender, open boats, the fast delivery boats that raced fresh fish across the bay to the markets of Edo before dawn, each with its crew of rowers. And the rowers are not flailing. Look closely at them. They are bent low, in perfect rhythm, gripping their oars, riding down the slope of one swell and facing into the next. They are doing their work. They are professionals of the sea, men who made this run in all weathers so that the city could eat. And Hokusai gives them no panic at all, only endurance and skill and unity, every back bent as one. Then the eye travels left and the sea stands up. The great wave rises at the left edge like a living mountain of water, curling over at its crest. And the crest does not simply foam. It breaks into fingers, into claws. Dozens of white claws reaching down over the boats. It is the exact instant before the fall. Not the crash itself. The moment before, the held breath, the wave at the very top of its power frozen there forever. It will hang above those rowers, never falling, for as long as paper survives in this world. And then, in the distance, framed in the hollow beneath the curling crest, sits Fuji. Tiny, serene, snow-capped, so that for one heartbeat your eye mistakes it for another white cap among the waves, and then understands. The nearest thing in the picture is water, which changes shape every instant. The farthest thing is the mountain, which has not changed in 10,000 years. Between them, small and unbowed, human beings at their work. The whole of life is in that one small sheet. Everything rises and falls, the picture says. The wave that towers this moment is spray the next, and through it all, something calm endures at the center, if you know where to look. The people of Edo did not need this explained. They bought the print by the thousands, and the printers pressed impression after impression from the woodblocks, thousands of sheets, until the fine lines of the blocks began to soften from sheer use. There is one more thing to see, and it is the thing I care about most. That wave was not a stroke of sudden luck. Hokusai had been drawing this wave for more than 30 years. In his 40s, he had made prints of great waves off this same coast, good ones, dramatic ones, and if he had stopped there, they would be footnotes now. He did not stop. Decade after decade, he returned to moving water, studied it in his sketchbooks, broke it down as no artist anywhere had ever broken it down, learning how a swell gathers, how a crest thins, how foam claws and scatters. Modern scientists who study the sea have looked at his final wave and found in it the true anatomy of a plunging breaker. Details a camera would not confirm until more than a century later because no human eye can freeze water in time. His eye, after 70 years of looking, apparently, could. When people call the great wave a work of genius, they are right. But it is genius of a particular kind, the kind I find most moving and most worth telling you about tonight. It is patience, compounded over a lifetime, until patience gleams like inspiration. He signed the wave and much of the series with a phrase that has a quiet thunder in it, Hokusai changing to Iitsu. The name Iitsu carries the sense of one again, of returning to one. 70 years old at the summit of his art, and his signature says, I am starting over. The series made those years his brightest. Alongside the wave came prints the country loves just as dearly, Fuji at dawn in a clear autumn wind, the whole mountain flushed, rust red against a blue sky combed with clouds, a picture so simple and so total that it feels less painted than revealed. Fuji above a sudden storm, its base wrapped in black cloud veined with red lightning, while the summit stands in sunlight, untouched. Travelers on the road, tea-pickers, fishermen, pilgrims, and always somewhere the mountain. After Fuji, he turned his old eyes on the country's waterfalls, on its famous bridges, on birds and flowers, on ghosts and poems. In his mid-70s, he produced a further masterpiece in book form, 100 Views of Fuji. In printed volumes, the mountain seen 100 more ways, through spiderwebs and smoke, and flights of cranes. And in the first of those volumes in 1834, he wrote a short afterword about his own life. And I want to give you its heart, because it may be the finest thing any artist has ever said about growing old. And it was written by a man of 75, in a rented room in Edo. From the age of 6, he wrote, I have had the habit of drawing the forms of things, and by 50 I had published countless designs. Yet of all I drew before 70, nothing is really worth counting. At 73, I have finally begun to grasp something of the true structure of things, of birds and beasts, insects and fish, of the way grasses and trees grow. Therefore, at 80 I shall have made real progress. At 90 I shall have penetrated the deeper meaning of things. At 100 I shall have reached something divine. And at 110, every dot and every line I make will be a life. He closed by asking those who lived long enough to bear witness that his words were not false. Most people fear age as a long subtraction. He drew it as a staircase and stood on the landing of 75 looking up, not down. To him, an old body was simply an instrument that had finally been tuned, and what makes the words unbearable and beautiful together is that he was not boasting. He was keeping accounts. He genuinely believed the ledger, and he worked every remaining day as if the schedule were real. His days in these final decades had a simple shape. He rose early and drew. He received publishers and students, sometimes gruffly, and drew. He ate simply, bought food, sweet things, and drew. When light failed, he drew by lamplight. He had by now a companion in the cluttered room, and she deserves her own place in this story. His third daughter, known to history by her artist name, Oi. She had been married once, to a painter, and the marriage had not held. It is said she laughed at his work once too often, and she came home to her father and stayed. She was a true painter in her own right, one of remarkable gifts, especially in the painting of light and shadow, of figures by lantern glow, of night itself. In the workshop they made an unforgettable pair, the old man and his daughter, both indifferent to housekeeping, both burning entirely for the brush, working side by side among the teacups and the sweet bun wrappers, moving house whenever the clutter won. He said of her, with a father's pride recorded by those who knew them, that in the painting of beautiful figures, she surpassed him. Some works that went out under his name in these years are believed to carry her hand within them. When you picture the old master now, picture them both, 2 lamps burning in one poor room, the most productive room in Edo. Trials still came, and I will not dwell on them, but you should know he outlasted everyone. At about 80, a fire took the house where he was living, and with it a lifetime of accumulated sketches and studies. A blow like that has broken many artists. He walked out with his brushes, essentially with nothing, and simply resumed. When, in his 80s, illness again threatened his hands, he set himself a discipline. Each morning, upon rising, he dashed off a small ink drawing of a lion, one lion every morning, swift and fierce and alive, and flung the page aside, a daily rite of his own invention to sweep away misfortune and greet the day new. Hundreds of these morning lions survive. An old man in his 9th decade, beginning every single day by proving to himself, in 30 seconds of ink, that the fire was still lit. And the fire drew people to him, to the end. In his mid-80s, he made a journey that is now legend, traveling out of Edo into the high country of Shinano, more than 100 miles into the mountains, to the town of Obuse, at the invitation of a wealthy patron there, a merchant farmer named Takai Kozan who revered him. An old man in straw sandals on the mountain roads, in his 80s, going where the work was. In Obuse, welcomed and honored, given a studio of his own, he painted some of the mightiest works of his entire life, huge ceiling paintings for the town's festival floats, a dragon coiling in cloud, a phoenix spreading fire-colored wings, and on one ceiling, a pair of great waves facing one another, a masculine wave and a feminine wave, the sea's power and the sea's grace, painted overhead so that the whole town on festival days would walk beneath the turning ocean of an old man's mind. They are still there, in Obuse, to this day. The town has kept faith with him for nearly 2 centuries. He came home to Edo and kept working. At 87, a painting of ducks in flowing water. At 88, in the first weeks of what would be his final year, a painting of a dragon, rising in a swirl of dark cloud past the snow-crowned cone of Fuji, up and beyond the summit, into the open sky. Painters and their students have always read that dragon one way. It is the old man himself, telling us where he intended to go. In the spring of 1849, in a rented cottage in Asakusa, in the city where he had been born when the city was young, the painter lay down for the last time. He was 88, and by the old way his country counts the years of a life, he had entered his 90th year. 90 years, 30 names, 93 houses, 30,000 works. His daughter Oi was beside him, and students and friends. And those who were present recorded his last words, and they are among the most famous last words in the history of art. He drew a long breath and said, "If heaven would grant me just 10 more years." He was quiet a while. Then he said, "If heaven would grant me even 5 more years, I could have made myself a true painter. 5 more years. From the man who had already given the world the wave." People sometimes hear those words as sorrow. They are the opposite. A man who despairs does not ask for 5 more years of work. He asks to be done. Hokusai, at the door of death, was still looking up the staircase he had drawn at 75, still certain the next landing was reachable, still in love, after 80 years and 30,000 works, with the act of making a line on paper. He died in the spring, with the plum blossoms gone and the year turning warm, not defeated but mid-climb, which is perhaps the finest way a working life can end. They laid him to rest in Asakusa. Edo mourned its impossible beloved old man, told its stories about him, and went on with its bustling life. And the wave, printed by the thousands, pinned on walls, tucked into drawers, wrapped around parcels, folded into the baggage of travelers, began, very quietly, to move. The old man's story was over. The story of what he had made was about to cross every ocean on earth. A sheet of paper is lighter than a breath of wind. And yet no ship, no army, no treasury of gold ever crossed the world's oceans with more effect than a few sheets of printed paper from the shops of Edo. In Hokusai's own lifetime, Japan kept its doors nearly closed to the outside world, and had for 2 centuries. One narrow channel remained open, a small trading post on a fan-shaped island in the harbor of Nagasaki, far to the southwest, where a handful of foreign merchants were permitted to live and trade. Through that needle's eye, a few things passed each year in each direction. Telescopes and glass came in, ceramics and lacquer went out, and already, even then, pictures were slipping through. A learned physician from a distant land, stationed at that post in the 1820s, took a deep scholarly interest in everything Japanese, and it is said that works from Hokusai's own hand and school reached him and travelled home in his collections while the master still lived. The old man in Edo never knew it, but the first ripples of his wave were already moving across the water before his brush was still. Then, in the years just after his death, the doors of the country opened, and the trickle turned to a tide. In the second half of the 19th century, goods from Japan began arriving in the port cities of the West in real quantity. Silks, ceramics, bronzes, lacquerware, fans. And with them, sometimes as precious cargo and sometimes, the story goes, as mere packing material, crumpled around the porcelain like yesterday's newspaper, came woodblock prints. There is a tale told from those years, and historians debate its details but treasure its truth, of Western artists smoothing out the wrapping paper from a crate of ceramics and falling silent at what they saw. Whether it happened exactly so hardly matters. What is certain is this. When the artists of the West first held Japanese prints in their hands, Hokusai's among them, they experienced something close to a revelation. You have to understand what painting in the West was like at that moment to feel the shock. Official art was oil paint, dark and dignified, history scenes and formal portraits framed in gold, judged by academies, bound by rules of perspective and finish that had ruled for centuries. And into that world came these sheets from Edo. Flat, radiant fields of color with no shadows, compositions that dared to slice a scene at the edge, that looked straight down from above or up from below, that left great breathing spaces of emptiness. Pictures of utterly ordinary life, a woman fixing her hair, rain on a bridge, travelers caught in wind, treated with the full seriousness of art. Lines that were alive. Everything the young rebel painters of the West had been groping toward, permission to see freshly, was lying there finished, on cheap paper, from a country most of them could not place on a map. They began to collect the prints with a hunger that grew into a craze, and the craze got a name of its own, built from the very name of Japan. Japonisme. For several decades, the most advanced art of the West sat at the feet of the printmakers of Edo, and no name among those printmakers stood taller than Hokusai's. Let me bring you 3 of those students of his, 3 of the most beloved names in all of Western art, one by one, quietly, as the night deepens. The first is Claude Monet, the painter of light, of gardens and rivers and haystacks in the changing sun. Monet began collecting Japanese prints as a young man and never stopped. In his famous house in the countryside, where he lived and painted to the end of his long life, he covered the walls with them, room after room, more than 200 prints, and among them 23 by Hokusai. which he hung where he could see them daily. Visitors described the dining room lined with them, but Monet did more than hang them. He planted them. In his garden he dug a water lily pond and arched a wooden footbridge over it in the Japanese manner, a piece of Japan grown in Western soil, and then he spent the last decades of his life painting that pond, those lilies, that floating world of water and reflected sky, hundreds of canvases that now hang in the greatest museums on earth and are counted among the summits of Western painting. When you stand before Monet's water lilies, you are standing downstream of Edo. He knew it and said it. He spoke of it openly, more than once, saying how much his art owed to the old masters of Japan. The second is Vincent van Gogh. If any Western painter loved Japan more helplessly, history has not recorded it. Van Gogh and his brother Theo gathered hundreds of Japanese prints. He pinned them to the walls of every poor room he lived in. He painted them into the backgrounds of his portraits, and for a period he made his own careful painted copies of Japanese prints, translating the woodblock lines into thick, bright oil, teaching his hand their language stroke by stroke. When he finally left the capital for the sun-drenched south, he wrote that he had gone there because the light and the clarity reminded him of Japan, a Japan he knew only through pictures, an ideal country of artists that the prince had built inside him. And in the autumn of 1888, in a letter to Theo, he wrote about one image above all, Hokusai's great wave. His brother had described an impression of it, and Vincent, who knew the print well and longed to own it, answered with words that have never been forgotten. He marveled that terror itself could be made from blue and green, and he wrote, "These waves are claws. The boat is caught in them. You can feel it. Claws. The exact claws Hokusai carved into the crest, seen and named across the world by the one pair of eyes perhaps best made to see them." The following summer, in the south, Van Gogh painted a night sky that rolls and breaks across the canvas in great curling crests of blue, with small lights riding beneath it, a painting now so famous it stands with the wave itself among the most recognized images humanity owns. The Starry Night. Many who study his work believe the memory of Hokusai's wave is rolling through that sky. Two images, made 60 years apart, an ocean apart, an old man of Edo and a young man of the West, now hanging in the world's memory side by side, curl answering curl, a blue wave and a blue sky, still answering one another across 2 centuries. The third is not a painter at all, and that is the wonder of him. Claude Debussy, the composer, the man who taught Western music to shimmer. Debussy loved the arts of Japan, and in his study where he worked there hung a copy of one picture, the Great Wave. For years he composed beneath it, and when he set out to write his largest orchestral work, a portrait in sound of the sea itself in 3 movements, the sea from dawn to noon, the play of the waves, the dialogue of the wind and the sea. He wrote much of it far from any coast, working, as he said, from memory and from art, from the sea inside him. He called the finished work La Mer, the sea, and it stands today among the most performed and beloved orchestral works ever written. And when it was published, in 1905, the composer, who fussed lovingly over the covers of his scores, saw to it that the first edition carried on its cover one image. Not a photograph, not a Western marine painting, a rendering of the great wave off Kanagawa, an old man of Edo, who in his whole life never heard an orchestra, had painted water so truly that a master of another art in another century on the far side of the world chose that wave to stand for the entire ocean. And for his own music, too. Somewhere tonight, in some concert hall on this planet, it is a fair bet that La Mer is being played. The wave still curls over every performance, and these three were only the crest of it. Sculptors shaped the wave in marble and onyx. Jewelers and glassmakers of the West borrowed its claws. Writers filled volumes on the master of Edo, and the first full biographies of him appeared abroad even as they appeared at home. Collectors competed for fine impressions of his prints, and museums in the great capitals of the world, one after another, laid Hokusai into their permanent collections, where his sheets now rest a few galleries away from the old masters of the West, honored guests who long ago stopped being guests. At the close of the 20th century, when an influential magazine across the sea drew up its list of the 100 people who had most shaped the previous 1,000 years of human life, kings and scientists and explorers, one Japanese name stood on that list. Exactly one. Not a shogun. Not an emperor. The mirror maker's boy from the lanes of Honjo, Hokusai. And his wave went on traveling, further than any of them could have dreamed, because the 20th century built new oceans for it to cross. It appeared on posters and book covers, in classrooms, on curtains and teacups. Surfers took it for their banner. When the age of computers arrived and the world agreed on a small alphabet of pictures for its messages, the little curling wave that now lives inside virtually every telephone on Earth was modeled on his print. Think of that as you hold your own phone some evening. Billions of people in every country of every language send each other a tiny piece of an Edo woodblock, most without ever knowing its name. And in Japan, in our own decade, when the nation redesigned its money, the new 1,000 yen note, the note that passes through more hands than any other, was given the great wave to carry. The old man who left his payment packets unopened on the floor now travels in every wallet in the country. He would have laughed, I think, a short, dry laugh, and gone back to his drawing. Scholars sometimes call his print the most reproduced image in the history of art. Stand back from that for a moment and take in the whole arc of it. A boy is born beside a drainage ditch in a wooden quarter of Edo, in a nation then almost entirely unknown to the wider world. He draws from the age of 6. He is orphaned of his masters, expelled, widowed, burned out, indebted, paralyzed, and none of it stops the brush. Past 70, with a new blue and an old mountain, he makes a picture of a wave. And that picture goes out from the print shops of Edo and quietly conquers the visual imagination of the entire human race, hanging in its museums, sounding in its concert halls, glowing on its screens, resting in its pockets. No emperor's decree ever traveled so far. The world didn't discover Hokusai out of politeness. The world looked at what an old man of Edo could do with wood, paper, and patience, and the world has honestly never recovered. And here, as the night grows late and your thoughts begin to loosen, I want to return to the very end of his story, to the words he left, because now, having traveled the whole way with him, you can hear them as they deserve to be heard. 5 more years, he said, and I could have made myself a true painter. The world has spent nearly 2 centuries answering him. Museums answered, Monet's garden answered, Van Gogh's sky answered, Debussy's ocean answered. 1 billion glowing screens answer him every single day. If Hokusai was not a true painter, then no one has ever painted. And yet, I would not correct him. because the hunger in these words is not a lack. It is the very engine that made everything we have spoken of tonight. He believed at 90 that his best work still lay ahead, and that belief is what carried a mirror maker's boy across 2 centuries and every ocean on earth. He kept his promise from the afterword after all, only not in the way he planned. At 100, something divine. More than 2.5 centuries after his birth, every dot and every line is still alive. So let his life leave you with this, as sleep comes near. Nothing in your story is finished. Whatever age you are, whatever this year has taken or given, the staircase is still there, and it goes up. The old man of Edo would tell you, in his gruff and cheerful way, that 70 is early, that every morning deserves one swift lion, that the room can stay messy if the work is true, and that a single patient line, drawn again and again across a whole lifetime, can end up curling over the entire world. You do not have to draw your wave tonight. Tonight your only work is to rest, the way the sea itself rests between swells, gathering quietly in the dark. So let the images of this night settle around you now, softly, one by one. The boy in the lantern-lit lane, drawing the tofu seller. The young carver's hands in the scented wood dust. The names, put on and laid down like traveling clothes. The North Star, holding still while everything turns. The old man and his daughter, 2 lamps in one cluttered room. The morning lions. The mountain roads to Obuse. The dragon rising past the summit of Fuji. And over it all, the wave. Forever at its highest moment. Forever about to fall, never falling. Holding its breath so that you can let yours go. Breathe out, slowly. The boats are steady. The rowers know their work. The mountain is calm on the horizon, and it will still be there in the morning. And so will you, rested, with a new day's paper waiting white and open before you. Whatever you are patiently practicing in this life, it is not too late for it. It was never too late. The proof is hanging in every great museum on earth, and it began in a small dark room, very much like this one, where someone quietly refused to stop. The lamps of Edo are going out now, one by one, along the river. The ink is drying. The brushes are laid down for the night. Even the great wave somewhere, in some quiet gallery, hangs in total darkness at this hour, resting, waiting for morning light. Rest now as it rests. Good night.